second study today, which is exploring how to encourage empathy for groups and the power of perspective taking. And this asks the questions of, how perspective taking can influence one's ability to feel empathy and require lower injustice standards for a group. And then whether there's a difference between in-group and out-group for this question. And the methods of this study were that the authors conducted 4 studies in total, all of which focused on the gender wage gap, and they measured how effective the manipulation was, the injustice standards, with how much evidence was needed to understand the discrimination in the wage gap by the participants, their empathic concern, and how these apply to in-group versus out-group members. In the first study, there was a total of 86 college students, and these participants were provided a short reading focused on the gender wage gap and received instructions whether to either remain objective or to imagine that they were the person or woman affected. Post-reading, were provided a questionnaire. They provided feedback about their thoughts to gauge what influence their perspective approach had. Second study was very similar to study 1, but included an additional measure for women, 1 for the in-group and 1 for out-group. And then there's a slight change in the questionnaire just to match those differences. And then study 3, the main difference of this study was rather than use 2 male research assistants, as in the first 2 studies, it included female research assistants as part of the manipulation testing, and otherwise the study was pretty much the same as study 1. And then study 4 was identical to study 1 and 3, though it was completed online.
Overall, it was showing us that perspective taking for a group can result in more empathy for that group and in a better understanding of the issues at hand. As this study kind of points out, a lot of previous research shows that you needed an individual one-on-one connection to kind of better understand an abstract group. But the study showed with all of this that may not necessarily be the case if you can find the right ways to do it. So an important note also was that you have to define oneself as not being part of the target group. So they did show that there was some difference in your ability to feel empathy for a group if you are in some way part of that in-group. If it's an out-group, however, it seems very successful that you can build empathy for that group. So having some sense of your self-identity is really important when people are looking at this, or if anyone wanted to do this in a community or an organization. It's important to know where people stand initially and then move forward from there. The studies, a lot of the results were very similar throughout, and they achieved for the most part what the authors were hoping to get out of these studies. So probably the biggest takeaways are that those who were in the imagine category, who had to put themselves in the place of that group in some way, did overall have more concern, empathic concern than those who were in the category to stay objective. And that was the same for men and women generally across the board. There were slight changes here and there depending on how they manipulated things and based on certain factors. So for instance, in the study 3, they had female research assistants over men, and they do think that actually played a role in how men participated in that study and their ability to do that. So there's multiple implications there that you could look at based on someone's experience with an in-group or out-group member. This particular case, though, because it was focused on gender, this may have played a bigger role than it might in another situation with that kind of experience with in-group versus out-group members, because this was something focused on the thing at that part on hand. The results overall, again, if you had the perspective taking role and you were supposed to imagine yourself in those person's shoes, you overall held lower injustice standards. which really means that you needed less evidence to be convinced of the problem at hand, and you showed more empathy overall. So I think it says a lot kind of based on that's different from some of the previous research and where we could kind of take things with that. I think finding ways to incorporate perspective taking it anyway, though, is a good tool to use for anyone in conflict resolution or peace building, just because it helps people understand, of course, something that they typically wouldn't or may not put themselves in those shoes otherwise. So I know this one's a bit of a beefy summary. So
what's the imagine or objective category? Like what does that mean?
So basically, and that's just kind of the way I summarized it to keep it with not so many words. But basically the people who are in the imagine category were told that they needed to imagine themselves in the role of the other person when they read the reading that they were given to then use the questionnaire. The objective category, those were people, and they were randomly assigned to one of these categories. So their instructions were that they were supposed to remain as objective as possible while reading that. And so the purpose of doing that was to see if you give the instructions to someone to imagine themselves in someone else's shoes, I take their perspective, does that actually result in that happening more? And the answer is yes. In this study, if you were asked to do that, you had a better and a higher chance of taking on that person's perspective than if you were not asked to.
And the study two was it was a study two that looked at it was somehow assigned in group versus out group.
Yeah, that one, men across the board were given an out group category. Women were given an in group or an out group. So some of those were women who, because these studies mostly were college students. So for women, they were given college students who were women and then non-college students who were women. And they showed that their empathy was greater for the out group or the non-college student women versus the in group. And they said that's where the identity of self kind of comes in. And there's a couple reasons why that could play a role. For instance, you may not see yourself as a victim, so to speak. So it's hard for you to feel empathy for a person in your in group because you wouldn't want to see them as a victim. But the out group, you might have a greater ability for empathy because you might see them more in that way of, oh, that's really terrible, but it's not me, if that makes sense. And there's other possible explanations, but that was one that they thought may be part of that.
So the idea is that the manipulation of asking someone to take someone's perspective worked better when it was an out group member. So for instance, when was the target always a woman in terms of the imagined person was always a woman?
Yes.
So it was always, so then it always worked better. The manipulation always worked better for men than women because women is the out group. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. And that's why study 3 was so significant, where they did the female research assistants versus men. And for instance, they thought that might play a role because if men saw, again, they didn't ask, but these are the implications, that if a man was being asked to read a survey about women and the gender gap in pay, but they see a woman research assistant, they might imply or subconsciously think that, oh, well, there's not really as much of a gap then because these women are here, or maybe they've manipulated the study to be in favor of women. So that was where that kind of came into play. And also why I said, in some ways it's showing if you have an experience with that out group member, maybe your response will be different. But I think it very much depends on the context, because in this case, that was a very specific part of the study as well. So it's not always to say out group contact could result in less empathy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, this idea that it's easier to take the perspective if you're asked to. It's easier to take the perspective and feel empathy for an out group than it is for your in group. and that your injustice standards are lower. And it actually, so it's interesting. I mean, it's there's a lot of implications there for kind of what's happening in society right now too. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that was why they said, there's a lot of research that shows typically people have more empathy for in-group rather than out-group. But they said, the difference here is that, one, that they asked people to do the perspective taking. And then in some of those cases, they measured people's empathy towards their in-group, but they didn't necessarily measure it towards the out-group, if that makes sense. So it was more on their feelings towards their own in-group, and then they made implications about then they feel less about the out-group, but that may not actually be the case.
Wait, okay, I'm sorry. So they didn't measure, wait, say that again. They didn't measure empathy towards the out-group?
Yeah, in certain studies. So they gave it like a specific example actually on one of their, and in the discussion portion of the paper, where they said that some of the studies that imply that people tend to feel more empathy for their in-group, some of those studies come to those conclusions, but because they did not gauge necessarily the empathy towards the out-group, it was kind of an implication per se. So this is saying there should be more emphasis and focus on understanding how you can build empathy for an out group and not just focusing on what our preferences for our in group might be.
Right. So preferences and empathy are two different things for sure. Because there's lots of research that shows people have preferences for their in group, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have more empathy for them. I don't know the empathy literature that much. Well, and it's you have to kind of look at also who the sample is, so this was a lot of college students, right? And that sample is typically, I mean, that is a sort of a population that typically feels a lot of empathy for out groups. It's kind of where they're at. So it'd be interesting to see how this runs in, a different type of sort of sample.
Yeah. I think that this study in particular, there's a lot of potential further research to do to better understand the outcomes that they had and how this affects different groups and different scenarios. And I think that's a given. But it's just interesting that, habitually it sounds like a lot of research is pointed towards you can't have empathy for a larger group, or you're less likely to, like in an earthquake or something, you're less likely to feel empathy for everyone, but you have that one person you connect to. But this is kind of saying maybe that's not the case. Maybe there are ways to build empathy without having to build that one-on-one connection.
Yeah. But what it was asking, was it asking to take the perspective of a group or of a person in the group?
Of the group.
So
I think
put yourself in that
women overall, and if you imagine yourself as one of these women, not necessarily a woman.
Gotcha. So like if you can imagine yourself as one of the group members, how would you?
Yeah.
I think that's a great tool, and I mean it's definitely widely used, this perspective taking of just as a a prompt, like imagine that you were this person, and and that is, I think that's something that a lot of especially therapists use today that are working with individuals and and psychologists. Like I think that that's a really great takeaway from this, and how we can use that in the work with our work as consultants in the working with conflict in the workplace. Like it's what we do, in mediations, like kind of sort of not so direct, but perhaps this could be another takeaway for consultants, but also just for leaders out there in the workplace, right? If you're seeing this kind of in-group, out-group within your team, maybe try something like this, like where you do some type of perspective taking role play, or
perspective taking in general, I think is, I mean there's something that that you can do where you can just ask someone to like take on this person, pretend you're that person. What would you say about you if you were them? You know, what do you think that they're going through? Explain it. Like give a steel man argument. You know, like argue on their behalf for like 1 minute and tell me what their perspective is. Like, you know, that's sometimes a good exercise, and it helps people get clear on like what the argument is, and then it could be a tool for perspective taking.
Mhm.
It's more of a cognitive tool, but it could probably prime some emotion.
Yeah, like empathy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's what I'm doing in classes right now is we're talking a lot about negotiations and stuff like that, and how perspective taking can be really good as a mediator, really good negotiation kind of skill to put on the parties and say, you know, like if we're talking about actual numbers, like, you know, what do you think? How do you think they're going to respond to that? To that offer, or how do you think they're going to respond to that, you know, that decision or whatever you decide to do? And often that they're like, yeah, I don't think they're gonna take it. I don't think that they would like it so much. And then it's like, okay, then how are we gonna frame this? What are we gonna do differently so that we can start this off in better faith and start this off so the other side knows that, you know, we want to come to a conclusion here, and are dedicated to that. And often that helps the whole negotiation process a ton, because you're starting off in good faith. The other party sees that and they're going to reciprocate, and then it can end pretty quickly.
Yeah, the piece about, yeah, I mean, that's certainly, I think when you're willing to open up or be vulnerable, it like sort of leads the way for the other one. But I think, Natalie, you said something about, and this is an interesting point, maybe getting to like, sort of identity psychology, which is like, maybe people don't empathize with their own group as much because they don't want to feel like a victim. So they would rather kind of unconsciously victimize another group, not thinking that they're victimizing them, just thinking that, hey, I'm empathizing with them, but it's in effect doing so because they don't want to feel like the victim or something like that. And so like if there's a way of perspective taking without creating a sense of victimhood, that's probably good too, because I think sometimes, especially if it's interpersonal, I mean intergroup too, but like if you feel like because in this case, what it was looking at, unless I'm wrong, was this other group is being potentially victimized by, you know, whatever, not by me, but by just like society and that kind of thing. But if we flipped it and said this other group is being victimized by you, like you're the reason, that might change the dynamic, because it's very hard for people to empathize, and it's very hard to for people to think of the other person as a victim when it's they and the one who's like doing the harm or something like that. So like that would just create defense. So yeah, I wonder if there's a way to do perspective taking without creating victimhood, because if you create victimhood especially in a relationship where you're dealing with conflict, then the person who's perceiving it could perceive themselves as like, uh-oh, I'm the bad one who created the victim. I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to empathize if that person's a victim. Forget that, they're not a victim, you know, that kind of thing. So maybe there's a way to do both.
I think what's coming to my mind, just because I just have our trainings on the brain, is you know, like looking back, like through using like the risk analysis to analyze a conflict, even that you were in. If you're doing it on yourself, right, you're seeing like, oh, what did I need in that moment as to that contributed to the conflict, and then asking, well, what do you think that other person?
Yeah.
Like that is, I think, a softer approach to doing it. So it's like, and to me, that would be not only analyzing the conflict and like the underlying roots of it to try and resolve and move forward, but also I'm sure there's a little bit of empathy building in that as well, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of doing it, you know, because you're yeah, you're doing it in a way where it is softer. You know, it may be more
Mhm.
a little more intellectual.
Yeah,
But
yeah, like we're doing an analysis. We're not.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not saying you're to blame. We're not saying you're wrong. We're just saying people's needs weren't met. But how do we get everyone's needs met? Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I would say for future research, if there was a way to replicate that study, but make it more, make the independent, make the like the condition, one of the conditions as being that you are the person who created the wage gap. You are the person who decided that this thing was going to happen, which affected this person. I wonder if their defenses would go up and they wouldn't feel like they could empathize.
Yeah.
Because that's what I see. It's like it's hard to get people to empathize with each other or perspective take even when they're feeling like, oh, I'm the bad guy. Oh, they're the victim and I'm the bad guy. Like that just goes whoop, defense, you know?
Yep.
No, I'm not. Bullshit, you know? So I wonder if we, you know, how that would work. And it's a good practice. It's like make sure we don't make someone the bad person if we want them to perspective take, empathize, find a place of peace. If we don't want their defenses up, don't make them bad and wrong either. You know,
Definitely be interesting. I'd like to read it.
future
I'd love to
research.
see someone do it.
Let's email the authors and be like, hey, this is what you should do next. Or we could replicate it. Just tell them, hey, we want to replicate it. We're going to change this one thing.